Well, that's quite a difficult act to follow, especially with a story about fish. But what I'm going to talk today about is probably a word that many of you won't have heard about before, something called aquaponics and also closed-loop systems. Ultimately, the work that I do is about creating an ecosystem approach to growing food. I think for me, the penny really dropped while I was doing my PhD research over in Southeast Asia, working on integrated farming systems and seeing the difference between farmers that really use their wastes as resources as opposed to others that are being driven to use more agrochemicals, more pesticides, and moving towards the conventional forms of agriculture. So aquaponics really involves two very sustainable technologies in their own right. Aquaculture, or the ability to grow fish and aquatic organisms in water, as well as hydroponics, the growing of plants without soil. When we bring these two technologies together, we form aquaponics. The ultimate idea behind it is we take the wastes from the fish and we use that nutrient-rich water as a feed for the plants. The plants then in turn take up those nutrients, filtering the water for the fish before it returns back as clean and sustainable closed-loop system. Ultimately, it's about recycling wastes into resources. It's about creating ecosystems in areas where they otherwise wouldn't exist. It's about combining complementary technologies together to try and close the loop on food production. About promoting biodiversity, and ultimately about producing food. And it's producing food that I'm going to talk a little bit more about now, particularly pertinent in the lead up to lunch. If we look at a system, and a food production system in particular, in terms of its inputs and outputs, we can judge that system based on its ability to generate more from less. If we look first at aquaculture itself, we have a cycle where we take the fish wastes, we use nitrifying bacteria to convert those wastes, and also filtration systems to allow water to be recirculated within a system. We have a number of inputs to the system. Firstly, fish food. There are a number of sustainability questions that I won't go into now about fish food, but the crux is around about 1.2 kilos to 1.4 kilos of fish food go in to produce 1 kilo of fish. They are the most efficient converters of protein in terms of farming livestock. We also have energy required to run water pumps and aeration to create an environment in which these animals can thrive and grow. And water. Recirculating aquaculture is actually very water efficient. It's defined by using only 10% of water every day. However, this 10% is need to be replaced and topped up from time to time. If we then look at our outputs, we produce fish, obviously, vital for a balanced and healthy diet. And then if we go into the technology that I've devoted my life towards developing, short life so far anyway, aquaponics ultimately involves still using these nitrifying bacteria, converting toxic ammonia into nitrite and nitrates. The nitrate is then the nutrient that can be taken up by plants, especially leafy green crops. The result is we have another output from the system using the same amount of food and energy going in, but we also decrease the amount of water used within the system. So I guess by integrating other technologies as well into the system, which is a big part of our work, we can reduce the inputs that go in to produce these crops. I should also say, within an aquaponic system, it's possible to grow 30 to 50 kilos of vegetables for every kilo of fish that you produce. So by integrating vermiculture, or wormeries as many people know it as, we know that we can take the waste from fish and grow plants with them. But once we've grown those plants, we take the waste of those plants, whether it's the root system or the outer leaves, and put them into wormeries. From that, we can produce vermicompost to provide soil enrichment for soil-grown crops. Also, worm teas, which provide a biopesticide to spray onto the plants, as well as a foliar fertilizer. But most importantly, the worms themselves, these can be used as a feed source to then feed back into the fish. Thus, we reduce our inputs to the system and we increase our outputs. Another very useful method that I could go on about for about 18 minutes alone is black soldier flies, these incredible little creatures that outcompete the disease-carrying blue and green bottle maggots. But ultimately, we take the fish wastes, whether it's cooked or uncooked, the guts, the head, and the processing wastes, and put them into enclosures where soldier flies eat and turn that waste product into a usable, nice little packaged form of protein. And in fact, if you give these soldier flies a 30-degree ramp, they'll actually harvest themselves, falling straight into a fish tank, sort of almost lemming-like. Due to animal byproducts legislation, we can't actually take the waste from a fish, feed them to soldier flies, and feed those soldier flies back to fish. So we have to incorporate another animal into our ecosystem. However, we take the soldier flies that have fed from those fish to produce food to feed to chickens, and then we use the chicken waste to produce more soldier flies to feed back to the fish. The result is obviously more outputs and further lowering our inputs. Along with the chickens, we obviously also get eggs. Another example of integrating is giant freshwater prawns, an animal that we're currently working with to try and close the loop and add more value to the system. When we have this nutrient-rich water and light entering that water, we inevitably produce algae. That algae provides the food then for another animal in the chain, such as the giant freshwater prawn, which helps clean the water and provides a value-added addition to the system. Similarly, we can increase the resilience of the system as a whole to breed our fish, to produce eggs and then fry, to repopulate the system or to start seeding other systems. But I guess one of the major inputs that we still see here is energy. And by looking beyond food itself, incorporating other technologies here, such as solar photovoltaic, if we incorporate these ecosystems into a greenhouse or a building, for example, we can use the energy from the sun, harnessing and capturing it from solar photovoltaic sources to provide both a lowering of the energy costs that we need to put into the system, but also through feed-in tariffs, providing another output, another economic output of the system. Similarly, using biomass heating, if we use the same energy from the sun captured and stored within trees, we can basically burn those trees to provide heat, to heat up the water. And with a tropical ecosystem comes enhanced productivity, thus reducing our heat inputs even further. And we can, next to these systems, incorporate short rotation coppice to chip our own biomass to heat the water. The remaining input that we can see is dominant, even though relatively speaking it's actually quite low. But if we incorporate things like rainwater harvesting technologies alongside our systems, when the rain falls, as it inevitably does in this country, we can store that water and use it to then replace any of the losses that are either taken up by vegetables or lost through evaporation. So ultimately, we're decreasing the inputs to this system, or we're increasing the outputs by creating these closed-loop and dynamic ecosystems. Ultimately, aquaponics is really about creating more from less. So where does aquaponics fit? My organization, a social enterprise, is working within a wide variety of different disciplines. Firstly, working with householders, families themselves, allowing them access to this technology to take it into their own homes, their greenhouses, their conservatories, to be able to produce food, healthy, fresh food for their own families. Also in schools, aquaponics really represents, for many of these sustainability messages, a Trojan horse, taking a lot of these messages into schools and engaging children in how many of our ecosystem functions work. Commercial production. We're working with a wide variety of producers, both here in the UK, also in North America and the Middle East, to try and reinvent the way that we grow food in a more sustainable and joined up manner. Similarly, for communities, I go from here up to an organisation, our next project in Moffat on the borders of Scotland, where a community have come together, bought a disused building for £1 from the council and are turning it into a multifaceted farming and community project. And urban agriculture. Obviously, aquaponics doesn't need soil fertility. It doesn't need access to wild resources. And it fits particularly well in areas where all we have is concrete. So it's urban agriculture that I'm going to focus on a little bit more now. We're subjected to some incredible images in the media about modern visions for urban agriculture by some of the leading architects in the world. And aquaponics fits within all of these systems. However, there's a slightly recurring theme that they seem a little bit far away from our current reality. So what I'm proposing really is that we explore our existing resources. We look at the buildings that we have in urban spaces, and we try and, whether it be for a 5-year period or for a 1-year period, we try and take those spaces over to grow food and to engage communities. On a daily basis, we are bombarded by opportunities from commercial operations, from communities, from councils, with resources in city centres that are currently being underutilised. These spaces all carry with it their own challenges, and not all of them are going to be suitable for urban agriculture. But I'm going to take you through some of the steps to show you really what we've done in the last few months with just one of these spaces. To start off with, we need to sort them out. We need to decide which is appropriate for our purposes. Ultimately, we need to categorize them in terms of their suitability, and it may not just be based on our aspirations. It may be due to further uses within development or other priorities. But if we take a space like this, this is in Dalston in Hackney in London, what used to be a very deprived area but is now very up and coming. What can be done in a space like this? It all started really with an idea and a partnership with a design firm called Something & Sons in London. The idea was to create a farm in a shop, quite simple, but ultimately to bring people together, people and communities together around the subject of food. We wanted to regenerate a disused space and to create a viable example of urban agriculture within a city context. The first challenge really for us, once we'd secured the building from Hackney Council, was to look at which technologies out of a whole plethora of different opportunities would be most appropriate for a site like this. Given the organisation I'm from, I obviously put a little bit of emphasis on aquaponics, but it really carries quite a lot of the messages. So we placed that in the front room of the building, and above that, put a chicken coop on the space on the flat roof above. We've got a damp, dark cellar, which is ideal for growing a wide variety of different mushroom species. Similarly, a polytunnel in the garden that shows people how food can be grown in a slightly different way, also using soil and using the compost that we create from the site. We need a kitchen, obviously, to process the food that we're producing, but also a cafe, the idea being that we can add value and we can create an offering to the many hundreds of people that come through the door. And a meeting room, that the idea of the meeting room really was to create a hub for like-minded individuals to come together around subjects of food, to share ideas and share aspirations for further development. So in terms of what the farm shop looks like, this is an image of the front room when we took it over. It had a sort of lick of paint at that stage, so it looked a lot better than when we first found it. But turning that space into an aquaponics system with a wide variety of different elements to it. We have fish tanks where we're growing tilapia. Tilapia are a great species because they're omnivorous, so we can feed them a wide variety of different food sources that sort of move away from many of the problems with aquaculture that rely on capture fisheries to produce fish meal into pellets to actually produce less fish than the fish that they're taking to produce the food, if you see what I mean. So tilapia are ideal. We're growing a wide variety of herbs and salad crops under energy-efficient lighting. And we have these rotating towers that I'll show you a little bit more about later on. Effectively, the idea was to create like a vegetable kebab. So in the same way that a kebab rotates around a heat source, we rotate plants around a light source. And that constant period of lighting and shading gives plants a very good environment to grow. We also get 40 plants in a square foot, and the idea is part of the cafe that people, when ordering a mint tea, for example, they don't get a tea bag, they get a pair of scissors and a pot of hot water, and they can pick their own. and the fish that are really responsible for feeding all of these different elements. We have a propagation room where we're growing plants that are then grown on floating rafts with their roots bathed in this nutrient-rich water. But ultimately, it's mainly the fish that get the children's imagination, both in terms of their behavior, but also how they fit into this complex yet quite simple ecosystem. In the corridor, we're growing kaffir bacteria as an example of what can be done in a space. And there's an artist tracking these cultures of bacteria that are given up to people that come and visit the shop, and looking at how the culture of bacteria are spreading into the culture of London itself. Here you can see ginger beer being grown using kaffir. The chicken roof, that's how we found it. And we built a rooftop chicken pen. It looks quite small, but in actual fact, the space that our 4 chickens have is equivalent to the space that 100 battery hens would have. And when you start to explain that to people, they really sort of grasp the reality. And the inevitable output of our chickens, and almost confirmation of their daily participation, is eggs. We actually have new egg boxes with the heads of each of the chickens, because we've identified the colour of the egg that matches the chicken. So on any particular day, someone can eat Mary or whatever. A meeting room upstairs, fairly normal space initially, but we aimed to sort of start to introduce different technologies, like a living basil wall that provides lighting for the room, as well as some quite nice smells to get rid of the chicken smell coming through the window. And a hydroponics room. It's important for us to demonstrate all of the technologies that are available. Hydroponics in this context uses a little bit more energy than we do in the aquaponics space, but it's important to show people what can be done. And in this room, we're growing year-round supplies of tomatoes, peppers, and chilies. And outdoors, we have a polytunnel space where it doubles up as a nighttime cinema with food-type project screenings for people to come, and also an extension of the cafe itself. Very shortly, we're going to be having 2 little wiener pigs arriving to an enclosure that's behind and to the side of the polytunnel. During the opening, we've had a huge amount of interest. This is, so we've been told, really the first example of urban agriculture that's being practiced in this diverse way, and something that people just walking off the street can come in and engage in. That's the farm shop as it looks today. Very interesting location, sandwiched between an age concern shop and an American nail boutique. But that's ideal for what the sort of messages that we're trying to carry through. It's also located right opposite a bus stop, so you, from inside, get some very interesting sort of double takes of people looking sideways, seeing a chicken on the roof and some fish below them. It's quite interesting. So extending this farm shop concept, we are currently in the process of extending this model and trying to make it real. How can we farm everywhere in our cities? The farm shop alone is not really enough. We can't produce enough food in that space to even service 10% of the people that come through our doors. What it does do is show people these methodologies and these technologies. So what do we need to make this model right for urban communities? I think we need to go above it, and we need to take on warehouse space as a commercially viable system to produce food. But similarly, we need to go below it. We want to engage the community themselves, whether it's on their rooftops, in their sheds, their flats, their cellars, or even their garages. But to be able to provide microfinance for people, outreach growers, to go home and take some of these technologies, maybe only one of them, but to practice them in their homes and then consolidate the produce back into the farm shop from below, but also taking the produce from above on these commercially viable scales. The result is, through our cafe and through retail, we'll be able to provide people with the freshest, locally produced food grown within a specific community. Also a farm box scheme, which we aim to deliver through a low-carbon delivery network to people's homes that may not have access directly to the shop. But also for restaurateurs, a click-and-pick mechanism where through a web interface, a restaurateur can choose a crop and have it picked within minutes, so that they get access to the freshest and the most local food possible. So in terms of, just to finish off, in terms of closing the loop and meeting our global challenges, what do we really need to do? It's been estimated we need to produce 50% more food by 2030. How do we do this? Ultimately, we need to produce more with less. We know our resources are finite, and we know our population is growing, so we need to produce more with less. In order to feed our growing population, I think we need to produce food everywhere. But ultimately, we need to reconnect people with food, and this is particularly pertinent in urban communities where children and adults don't get access to seeing many of the food that they eat simply being grown. So we need to excite, to inspire, and to engage the next generation to give them the skills possible to meet our global challenges. And that's it.